In this section, we'll look at the unfortunate situation for African Americans during the Progressive Era. I should first note that not all Progressive Era reforms were positive from the perspective of today. The progressive sentiment to improve society contributed to the pseudoscience of eugenics. Eugenics was the control of reproduction to alter a plant or animal species, and some progressive reformers urged that it could be applied to human reproduction as well, a way to improve society. Simply put, those with less desirable traits or with predispositions to disease, they could be sterilized and prevented from reproduction. Eugenics was kind of related to the growing nativism, the anti-immigrant sentiment of the Industrial Revolution, and it didn't bode well for African Americans or anybody non-white either. Now, turning to African Americans specifically, you might think today, from the 21st century perspective, that the Progressive Era would be a pretty good period for African Americans. The progressives, after all, were trying to improve society, and there was a clear, problem with civil rights. During the day, the law of much of the land was racial segregation, and it was known by the phrase Jim Crow. The term Jim Crow came from a traveling vaudeville show that had a stereotypical racist view of a black character named Jim Crow, and he was always played by a white guy in blackface. The term came to represent all blacks, and in time, the segregation laws that kept them down. And so, this is blatantly unfair today. You'd see this as obvious. But you have to go back and realize that that's not the way that progressive reformers thought. They were, after all, still men and women of the late 19th century, and many shared the dominant sentiment of the day, that African Americans were inherently inferior. Now, given their desire to improve society, they thought empowering the inferior would prove counterproductive. Now, this horrible sentiment was not true for all progressives, but it helps explain why the Progressive Era was not a good period for African Americans, even though we might think so today. In fact, in 1894, the Supreme Court ruled in the infamous case Plessy versus Ferguson that the principle of Jim Crow, the principle of segregation, was constitutional. In a Louisiana case involving separate railroad cars, the Supreme Court ruled 7-1 that separate was okay if there was equal opportunity. This separate but equal legal construction remained the law of the land for the next half century until 1954's Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. Of course, in reviewing Plessy v. Ferguson, the justices didn't apparently attempt to ascertain whether any given facilities were, in fact, truly equal. Now, in reality, of course, the facilities were never equal, and the injustice persisted. The justices were just ruling on whether races could be segregated, and they said they could, but they didn't really get into the separate second part of that about whether they were equal. With frustratingly no help from the progressive reformers, African Americans debated how to react, how to effect change themselves. Booker T. Washington believed that protesting for legal change was fruitless, although he secretly contributed to lawyers battling Jim Crow. Whites were the overwhelming majority and genuinely believed blacks were inferior, Booker T. Washington noted. As long as they maintained this wrong view, they would find a way around the laws, whatever they were. The key to Booker T. Washington was to address the underlying assumptions of inferiority and racism. Now, once whites saw blacks as equal, the laws would follow. Booker T. Washington was born a slave and freed as a child with the end of the Civil War. He argued in his autobiography, Up from Slavery, and to audiences whenever he could, that blacks needed to get first an industrial education, since the only job presently open to them were in industry. Through hard work, and in time, they would address the racist assumptions of inferiority by making whites dependent and impressed by the quality of their character, the quality of African American character. New opportunities for true equality would then arise. It wasn't fair and it would take time, and it was known by Booker T. Washington's critics as the Atlanta Compromise. But, Booker T. Washington believed that to do otherwise, to protest, would do nothing more than harden white resistance and make the chances for advancement and equality even more remote. Booker T. Washington founded a school for African Americans in Alabama, known as Tuskegee Institute, and today it's known as Tuskegee University. In this bottom right photo, you can see Booker T. Washington in the first row in the middle among other faculty at Tuskegee Institute. While Booker T. Washington remained a leader in the African American community, not all African Americans agreed with his more compromise accommodationist stance. W.E.B. Du Bois was one. After earning a Ph.D. in history from Harvard in 1895, Du Bois taught at Wilberforce College in Ohio, the University of Pennsylvania, and finally Atlanta University, openly criticizing Booker T. Washington in his book The Souls of Black Folk, published in 1903. W.B. Du Bois rejected the call for patience and the exclusive call for manual and industrial skills. Du Bois argued for more protest and more litigation. Du Bois asked, what are the talented tenth, the top 10% of African Americans who were already educated and who already had excellent credentials? Were they expected to take industrial jobs as well? Du Bois' more militant stance signaled a new era of African American activism. In 1905, under his leadership, African Americans who favored a more vigorous resistance to racism held a conference at Niagara Falls. They were actually forced to cross Niagara River into Canada because the racist hotel owners didn't want them meeting there. Anyway, for the next few years, the participants in the so-called Niagara Movement met annually. Meanwhile, a group of white reformers led by the newspaper publisher Oswald Garrison Villard, who was a grandson of the abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, had also grown dissatisfied with Booker T. Washington's cautiousness. In 1909, Villard and his white allies joined with Du Bois and other African Americans from the Niagara Movement, and together they formed the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, commonly known by its acronym NAACP. The NAACP called for sustained activism, including legal challenges and petitions and more activist stance, to achieve political equality for African Americans and full integration into American life. And they attracted the urban black middle class that was growing, and by 1914 the NAACP had over 6,000 members in 50 branches. This concludes the section on the African Americans during the Progressive period.